It was September 2025, and the United Nations General Assembly in New York was supposed to be a celebration, the 80th anniversary of the charter that promised peace, justice, and equality among nations. Delegates in their suits adjusted microphones, cameras rolled, and translators readied their headsets. But what followed was not ceremony. It was a thunderclap. The Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, speaking on behalf of President Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stood before the world and declared terrorism is being used as a convenient pretext to pillage African resources. These terrorists are not shadowy groups hiding in caves. They are the troops of predatory foreign armies. In that single moment, silence gripped the hall. For decades, Africa had been told that foreign troops were there to protect. Now the truth was spoken out loud: they were there to exploit. France was named directly. Its media was accused of serving as a mouthpiece for criminals. And the United Nations itself was called powerless, unable to enforce its own principles, reduced to a tool in the hands of the powerful. For the people of Burkina Faso and for millions across Africa, this was not just a speech. It was a reckoning. Under Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier-turned-president, a nation battered by terrorism has chosen dignity over submission, sovereignty over dependence. With their own hands, citizens raised billions in a patriotic fund, reclaimed land, and sent their children back to reopened schools. Now their leaders carried that same spirit into the heart of global diplomacy. But the deeper question remains: will the world listen? Will the United States, France, and the so-called guardians of international order admit that the system they built is failing Africa? Or will they silence yet another truth-teller? Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's call for justice is the beginning of real change, or just another voice lost in the noise of diplomacy? Please share this video if you feel you are one of the first to hear and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision. And subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than headlines. The United Nations Hall was not prepared for what followed. After polite greetings and formalities, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, speaking with the authority of President Ibrahim Traoré, began dismantling decades of polite silence. His words were not the usual diplomatic jargon. They were raw, pointed, and impossible to ignore. He declared that terrorism, the very threat invoked by foreign powers to justify their endless presence in Africa, had been twisted into a false mask. These terrorists, he said, are not nameless figures in the desert. They are the troops of predatory foreign armies. With this one line, the narrative flipped upside down. The idea that France, the West, and their partners were peacekeepers was shattered. Instead, they were named as enablers, even architects of violence. France, under Emmanuel Macron's regime, was accused outright of feeding propaganda through its media, serving as the voice of those who commit crimes against ordinary African citizens. Then came the second strike, a condemnation of the United Nations itself. How, he asked, can an institution built on the ideals of 1945 be reduced to silence today? How can it claim to safeguard peace when its Security Council has become a tool of rivalries and its General Assembly a forum without power? 8 decades, he reminded the hall, had brought not justice, but disappointment, shattered dreams, unfulfilled promises, and a growing mistrust from those the UN was supposed to serve. The Prime Minister laid out evidence with both facts and emotion. Billions poured into peacekeeping missions had left Africa with little but ashes and displacement. Resolution 1373, which obliges the world to cut off terrorist financing and secure borders, was ignored by the very powers that helped draft it. Meanwhile, Africa, a continent of over 1 billion souls, still held no permanent seat on the Security Council. The contradiction was impossible to miss. But Burkina Faso's speech was not only about failures. It was also a declaration of what was possible when a people chose dignity. The Assembly heard of the Patriotic Support Fund launched under President Ibrahim Traoré, which by 2025 had collected more than 413 billion CFA francs from citizens, diaspora communities, and allies. This was not charity from the outside. It was sacrifice from within: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and workers donating their earnings to protect their sovereignty. The results were undeniable. 72% of national territory, once under terrorist control, had been reclaimed. Entire communities of internally displaced families were returning home. Schools closed for years were reopening. Social services once broken were beginning to heal. This was the reality Traoré wanted the world to see: not a dependent nation begging for handouts, but a people who had chosen to rise. The speech tied these victories to a larger vision: economic independence. Burkina Faso was breaking away from the colonial cycle of exporting raw materials only to buy back finished goods at 10 times the price. Instead, the government was pushing industrialization, food sovereignty, and control over natural resources. It was a promise that the wealth of the land would serve Burkinabe citizens, not foreign shareholders. Then came the broader connection: Burkina Faso was not alone. Alongside Mali and Niger, it formed the Confederation of Sahel States (AES), a new alliance built not on dependency, but on self-determination. This is not retreat. The Prime Minister declared this is dignity. With names like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah invoked, the hall was reminded that this moment was part of a longer African struggle for liberation. The first part of Burkina Faso's message was clear: Africa is no longer a stage for the ambitions of others. It is a continent reclaiming its voice. And in that hall, for the first time in decades, many could feel the weight of history shift ever so slightly. As the speech moved deeper, the hall could feel the shift. What began as sharp accusations soon transformed into a crescendo of defiance and triumph. Burkina Faso was not simply lamenting its suffering, it was announcing a victory and demanding that the world recognize it. The Prime Minister's voice grew firmer as he recounted the figures that no one could dismiss. 72% of Burkina Faso's territory once lost to armed groups had been reclaimed. This was not thanks to foreign troops or billion-dollar missions from New York or Paris. It was the work of Burkinabe soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary citizens who chose to defend their soil. Entire towns that had once lived in fear now saw their children return to schools. Markets that had been empty reopened with laughter and trade. Fields long abandoned to dust were being planted again. At the center of this transformation was the Patriotic Support Fund. Created under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, it was no ordinary initiative. It was a living testament to a people's will. By 2025, it had raised over 413 billion CFA francs, not from foreign loans, but from the hands of Burkinabe citizens and diaspora members across the globe. Teachers gave part of their salaries. Farmers donated from their harvests. Traders in the markets contributed coins from daily sales. Even the poorest gave what little they could. This was not just money, it was faith turned into action. The hall erupted in applause at this moment. For the first time in decades, an African leader was showing the world that his people were not beggars, but builders of their own destiny. The applause was not universal. Some delegates clapped cautiously, others remained rigid, but the impact was undeniable. The myth of African dependency had been shattered right there at the UN podium. Then came the boldest declaration: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had formally united under the Confederation of Sahel States (AES). Far from isolation, this was portrayed as a renaissance, an alliance rooted in dignity, sovereignty, and shared struggle. We are not retreating from the world, the Prime Minister declared. We are asserting our right to decide our own future. The reaction was electric. Some African delegations nodded with pride. Western envoys whispered uneasily, their faces betraying frustration. For France, being singled out as a state that publicly supports criminals was a diplomatic humiliation. For the United Nations itself, hearing the Security Council described as a troublemaker was a direct challenge to its legitimacy. But it was the invocation of history that lifted the speech into something larger than politics. Names like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah echoed through the chamber, their spirits recalled, as if to remind the audience that this fight was not new. Burkina Faso was not acting alone in 2025, it was continuing a struggle that stretched across generations. Sankara had once declared that only struggle liberates, and now Ibrahim Traoré's government was proving that struggle was alive and victorious. The climax built further as the Prime Minister turned his focus on the hypocrisy of global powers. He pointed to Resolution 1373 binding on all members to cut terrorist financing, yet ignored by the very states accusing Africa of instability. He asked why peacekeeping missions worth billions left only despair, and why 1 billion Africans were denied a permanent voice on the Security Council. Each question was a blow, each answer an indictment. In those minutes, the General Assembly was no longer a diplomatic forum. It had become a courtroom, and the defendants were the powers who had long claimed moral authority over Africa. The reaction outside the hall mirrored the tension inside. African social media lit up with pride. Diaspora communities from Paris to New York shared clips declaring, "At last, someone spoke the truth." Western media, however, scrambled to frame the speech as radical or populist. And yet they could not erase the numbers. 72% of land recovered, 413 billion. CFA raised children back in school. These were not slogans. They were facts. For Americans watching from afar, the moment carried an uncomfortable resonance. They knew the story of foreign wars sold on false pretenses. They remembered Vietnam. They remembered Iraq. And now, here was a young African leader calling out the same logic, except this time Africa was not asking for permission to resist. The climax of Burkina Faso's speech was clear. The era of silence was over. A sovereign people had stood up, reclaimed their dignity, and demanded that the world acknowledge their triumph. The aftershocks of Burkina Faso's address to the United Nations were not confined to the marble walls of New York. They rippled back to Ouagadougou across the Sahel and into the hearts of ordinary citizens who had long felt invisible on the global stage. For them, the speech was not simply words, it was validation. It was proof that their sacrifices, the coins dropped into the Patriotic Support Fund, the nights spent guarding villages, the lives lost in defense of their homes, had not been in vain. Domestically, the impact was immediate. Families displaced by terror began returning with renewed confidence, not just because soldiers held the ground, but because their leaders had declared that the world must recognize their struggle. Mothers carried children back into classrooms proud that schools once abandoned were buzzing again with laughter and lessons. Farmers replanted fields encouraged by the government's pledge to prioritize food sovereignty and end dependence on imports. For the first time in years, hope began to replace fear. Politically, the speech marked a turning point. President Ibrahim Traoré's government, often dismissed by critics as transitional or temporary, was now seen by its people as a steady hand capable of navigating both battlefield and diplomacy. The figures cited 72% of territory reclaimed, 413 billion CFA raised, internally became national symbols of resilience. They told a story that no foreign headline could distort, that Burkina Faso was writing its own destiny. The Confederation of Sahel States (AS) also gained unprecedented legitimacy. What might once have been dismissed as a fragile alliance of embattled nations now looked like a credible alternative to dependence on Western security structures. By linking their struggle to historical Pan-African leaders like Sankara and Lumumba, Burkina Faso's message elevated the AES from a regional bloc to a movement, one that could inspire other African nations questioning their place in the global order. Internationally, the political consequences were just as profound. The United Nations itself faced an uncomfortable mirror. If the Security Council was publicly branded a troublemaker, how could it maintain credibility without reform? African delegates who had long whispered frustrations now had a rallying point. Demands for a permanent African seat on the Security Council, once treated as symbolic, began to gain weight. The image of a billion people excluded from global decision-making became harder to defend. For France, the consequences were more personal and humiliating. Being named in front of the entire General Assembly as a supporter of criminals was not something easily brushed aside. French diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, but the damage was done. Across West Africa, citizens who already distrusted Paris now had confirmation from the UN's main stage. In cafes and markets, the phrase "France is the mouthpiece of criminals" began circulating, solidifying France's reputation as an unwelcome guest rather than a partner. Meanwhile, within Burkina Faso, civil society and diaspora groups felt emboldened. They saw their government not only surviving, but shaping global discourse. Activists called for deeper reforms, transparency in governance, fairer distribution of wealth, and stronger investment in health and education. For them, sovereignty was not just about borders, it was about building a society where dignity extended into every home. The political class, too, took note. Opponents who had once doubted Traoré's staying power now had to reckon with his strengthened mandate. International partners who sought to pressure Burkina Faso with reports or sanctions were met with a confident rejection: "Our priorities are non-negotiable." The greatest consequence, however, was psychological. For decades, many Africans had accepted the idea that real power was decided elsewhere in Paris, Washington, or New York. This speech flipped that narrative. It reminded citizens that their voices, their sacrifices, and their unity could alter the course of history. In the wake of the speech, Burkina Faso was no longer just a small, landlocked nation fighting for survival. It was a symbol proof that even in the harshest conditions, a people bound together by dignity and determination could challenge the strongest powers and still stand tall. From Washington to Paris, from Moscow to Havana, Burkina Faso's intervention at the United Nations did not pass unnoticed. In fact, it forced capitals across the globe to ask a difficult question: what if the smallest nations can no longer be silenced? For the United States, the speech carried an uncomfortable echo. The accusation that terrorism is a convenient pretext to pillage African resources sounded eerily similar to criticisms once leveled at America's own wars in Vietnam and Iraq. Many older Americans watching could not help but remember the justifications they had been given decades earlier: claims of protecting freedom, rooting out threats, building democracy, that later collapsed under the weight of hard truth. Burkina Faso's message struck a nerve. Africa, too, had been told the same lies. And now a young president named Ibrahim Traoré was daring to expose them in the world's highest forum. Reactions in Europe were sharper. France, singled out directly, saw its diplomatic standing further eroded in Africa. French commentators struggled to frame the accusations as exaggerations, but clips of the speech went viral across West Africa, leaving little room for spin. For nations in the Sahel, France's loss of credibility was America's warning. Western presence justified by counter-terrorism could no longer be taken at face value. Elsewhere, the response was different. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua all explicitly defended in the speech, applauded Burkina Faso's courage. Russia and China, already building ties with Africa, seized the opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of Western powers. To them, Burkina Faso's words were not radical, but refreshing proof that the global order was shifting toward multipolarity. For the United Nations itself, the challenge was existential. If 1 billion Africans remained locked out of permanent decision-making while peacekeeping missions failed to deliver, how long could the institution survive without deep reform? Commentators compared the UN to the defunct League of Nations, warning that history might repeat itself if change did not come. And for ordinary viewers, especially older Americans, the speech raised pressing questions. Can the UN truly guarantee peace, or has it become another tool of the powerful? If Ibrahim Traoré's people can reclaim land, schools, and dignity with their own hands, should the world continue to dismiss Africa as dependent or recognize it as a rising force? The world had heard the message. What remained was whether it would respond. 80 years after the signing of the UN Charter, the question lingers heavier than ever: has the world learned anything, or has it merely perfected the art of repeating failure? Burkina Faso's voice, carried through its prime minister on behalf of President Ibrahim Traoré, has reminded the global community that silence is no longer an option. The applause, the unease, the whispers in New York all pointed to the same truth. The system is cracking. The warning could not be clearer. If the United Nations refuses to reform, if it continues to deny Africa a permanent seat and ignores the sacrifices of 1 billion people, then it risks going the way of the League of Nations, a relic remembered for its impotence rather than its achievements. The Security Council, called a troublemaker in front of the entire world, now faces a crisis of legitimacy. Without change, its authority will erode further, and with it, the fragile trust of the nations it claims to serve. But beyond the warning lies an awakening. Burkina Faso's journey, reclaiming 72% of its territory, raising 413 billion CFA from its own citizens, reopening schools and farms, is not just a national story. It is a model. It shows that sovereignty, once dismissed as a dream, can become reality when people unite behind leaders willing to risk everything for dignity. Ibrahim Traoré's message was not only to the West, but also to Africa itself: we can stand. We can choose our own future. For Americans watching, especially those who have lived through Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the echoes are unmistakable. They know what it means to send soldiers abroad under the banner of security, only to discover the real motives were power and resources. They know the cost of silence. And now they must ask, will the United States side with truth and reform, or cling to a system built on contradictions? The call is no longer diplomatic. It is human. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the wider African continent are demanding partnership built on respect, not domination. They are asking the world and us to choose between justice or decline, solidarity or hypocrisy. So we turn to you. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies are laying the foundation for lasting change? Can the United Nations survive without giving Africa its rightful place? And most importantly, can we afford to ignore the rising voices of a continent that has decided it will no longer be silent? Please share if you feel you are among the first to witness and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, and comment below because your voice, like Burkina Faso's, deserves to be heard.